Hey guys, tonight we are traveling a very long way back. Not just centuries, not just 1,000 years. We're going back roughly 5,000 years to a place that most people couldn't find on a map today, but which gave the modern world almost everything it runs on. We're going to Sumer. And before you ask, no, it is not related to the season. The name likely comes from the Akkadian word Shumerim, though historians still debate its precise origin, which is fitting, really, because the Sumerians invented debate too. Or, at least, they invented writing it down. Tonight's journey will take us through the marshy river delta of ancient Mesopotamia, a word that simply means the land between the rivers in Greek. Those rivers were the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they flowed through what is now modern Iraq, cutting slow brown paths through a flat, sun-baked landscape that somehow became the cradle of urban civilization. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just close your eyes and imagine a wide, open sky. Stars overhead, more stars than you have ever seen, because there are no city lights for thousands of miles in any direction. There is a warmth in the air, even at night. The smell of river water drifts toward you, cool and faintly green, carried on a breeze that moves through tall reed beds along the bank. Frogs call somewhere in the dark. An owl shifts on a palm branch. Somewhere in the distance, a low fire glows. That fire belongs to people who are doing something extraordinary, something so ordinary to them that they would not think twice about it, but something that had never been done quite like this before anywhere on Earth. They are building a city. Not yet. Not tonight. Tonight they're just settling in, feeding their families, watching the river, and trying to figure out how to keep the floods from destroying everything they have planted. But the city is coming. It always was. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like leaving a comment, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what time it is there. There is something quietly wonderful about picturing all of you scattered across the globe, in your different time zones, all drifting towards sleep together. Now, let's talk about where the Sumerians came from, and why that question is more complicated than it sounds. Nobody is entirely sure who the Sumerians were in the deepest ethnic and linguistic sense. Their language, simply called Sumerian, is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no known relatives. It is not related to Arabic or Hebrew or Persian, or any of the Semitic and Indo-European languages that eventually dominated the region. It stands alone like a lone palm tree in a flat field, connected to nothing else we have found. This has led to all sorts of theories over the years. Some early archaeologists, working in the 19th century with more enthusiasm than evidence, proposed that the Sumerians must have come from somewhere else. India, Central Asia, even Atlantis, which tells you more about the 19th century than it does about ancient Mesopotamia. The more measured academic view today is that the Sumerians likely developed gradually in place, possibly mixing with earlier populations who were already farming the river delta before written records began. But the honest answer is that we simply do not know, and the mystery remains genuinely open. What we do know is that by around 4,500 BCE, something remarkable was stirring in the flat, wet lowlands at the mouth of those two great rivers. The landscape itself is worth pausing on. Southern Mesopotamia, the region the Sumerians would eventually dominate, is extraordinarily flat. There are no mountains, no natural defenses, no dramatic rocky outcroppings. Just an almost perfectly level plain, crossed by slow rivers and threaded with marsh channels, edged by date palms and dense reed beds that could grow taller than a person. It was, in many ways, a difficult place to live. The summers were brutal. Temperatures today still regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius in the Iraqi interior. The rivers flooded unpredictably. The soil, while fertile, required constant management. There was almost no stone, no timber, no metal to speak of. Everything useful had to be traded for or invented from scratch. And the Sumerians, with remarkable stubbornness and ingenuity, chose to stay anyway. They built with what they had: mud, reed, palm fiber. They shaped bricks by hand, dried them in the sun, stacked them carefully, and made houses that could last decades if properly maintained. They wove reed mats and baskets so tightly that they could hold water. They watched the floods year after year and slowly began to understand the rhythms of the rivers. And somewhere in that long, patient observation, civilization began. It did not happen all at once. No great inventor sat down one morning and decided to create the world's first city. It happened slowly, season by season, generation by generation. Small decisions accumulating into something vast and unprecedented. That slowness is part of what makes this story so restful to follow. There is no single dramatic moment, just a long, gradual brightening, like the sky before sunrise, almost imperceptibly growing lighter, until one morning you look up and realize it is fully day. Tonight, we will watch that slow brightening together. The fire in the distance still glows. The reeds still rustle. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the world's largest reed marsh. Not a small wetland beside a highway. Not a quiet pond at the edge of a park. We're talking about something vast. A labyrinth of water channels and towering reeds stretching in every direction as far as you can see, the sky reflected in still dark water below, the air thick with the smell of green growing things and warm mud. This is where the story of Sumer truly begins. Long before there were cities, long before there were temples or written laws or royal tombs, there were people living quietly in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia. Archaeologists call the earliest of these settled communities the Ubaid culture, named after the site Tel al-Ubaid in modern Iraq, where their remains were first identified. They were farming and fishing here as early as 6,500 BCE, which means their story began nearly 3,000 years before the cities we usually associate with Sumer even existed. 3,000 years is a long time to be quietly perfecting your reed weaving technique. The Ubaid people were not yet Sumerians in the way we typically use that word. They were the foundation layer, the slow accumulation of knowledge and practice that made everything else possible. And their world was defined almost entirely by water. The marshes of southern Mesopotamia, known today as the Iraqi marshlands or the Awar, are one of the largest wetland ecosystems in the world. At their ancient peak, they covered an area roughly the size of modern Belgium. They were, and in their partially restored state still are, a world unto themselves. A world of narrow water channels threading between walls of golden green reeds, of shallow lakes where fish moved in slow silver schools beneath the surface, of floating islands built up from compressed reed roots, solid enough to build a house on. And the people who lived here built remarkable things from remarkably little. Their houses were made almost entirely from the giant marsh reed, Phragmites australis, which could grow to 6 meters in height, taller than most modern ceilings, and strong enough when bundled and bent to form graceful arching structures that have been continuously used in this region for thousands of years. These reed houses, called muddifs in the Arabic tradition that eventually followed, were engineering achievements built without a single nail or screw. Bundles of reeds were pushed into the ground in parallel rows, bent toward each other at the top, and lashed together to form a series of arches. Woven reed mats were then layered over the outside for weatherproofing. The result was a structure that was cool in summer, surprisingly warm in winter, and could be dismantled and rebuilt in a matter of days. The Marsh Arabs, the Madan, were still building and living in nearly identical structures in the 20th century, and some do so today. It is one of the longest unbroken architectural traditions in human history, and it began here, in these quiet channels, in the pre-dawn of recorded time. Now imagine the sounds. A warm morning, the light just beginning to soften the sky from deep blue to pearl. The reeds around you are moving very slightly, stirred by a river breeze coming in off the Euphrates to the west. Somewhere close by, a purple heron lifts itself from the shallows on wide, slow wings. Frogs fall silent as it passes, then resume their conversation. The smell of wood smoke drifts from a nearby house. Someone is awake early, feeding a fire, perhaps heating water in a clay pot. A child's voice carries across the water. Then quieter again. This was morning in the Marsh villages of ancient Mesopotamia, for hundreds of generations before a single brick was laid for a city. The early Ubaid settlers were skilled farmers as well as marsh dwellers. On higher ground near the river levees, narrow raised strips of land built up by centuries of flood deposits. They grew emmer wheat and barley, tended small orchards of date palms, and kept herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. The date palm deserves special attention here, because it was perhaps the single most important plant in all of ancient Mesopotamian life. A date palm produces fruit. Its leaves make roofing material and basket-weaving fiber. Its trunk, when old, can serve as a construction beam. Its sap can be fermented. Even its seeds were ground and fed to animals. Mesopotamian administrative texts from later centuries list over 360 uses for the date palm, which means someone was counting very carefully. Someone was always counting very carefully. That habit would eventually become writing. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again. The eccentric detail worth pausing on here is that the Ubaid culture shows remarkably consistent material style across a very wide geographic area. Their distinctive painted pottery, with its geometric patterns in dark paint on a buff background, has been found not just in southern Mesopotamia, but as far north as modern Turkey and Syria, and as far south as the Arabian Peninsula coast. Archaeologists debate vigorously about what this means. Was it trade? Migration? Cultural diffusion through contact networks? Or something else entirely? Historians still argue whether the spread of Ubaid pottery represents a migration of people or simply the adoption of a prestigious cultural style, the ancient equivalent of everyone suddenly wanting the same brand of trainers. The honest answer is that we do not know. And that uncertainty is part of what makes this period so quietly fascinating. What we do know is that these early marsh communities were not isolated. They were connected through river travel, through trade, through the slow movement of people and ideas across a landscape that, while flat and featureless to an outsider, was deeply familiar to those who lived on it. They knew every channel, every seasonal fish run, every patch of dry ground reliable enough to plant. They had been learning this landscape for generations, and they were, slowly and without quite knowing it, about to transform it entirely. The reeds still sway. The heron is gone now, a dark shape dissolving into the pale morning sky. Something is beginning. The rivers gave everything, and the rivers took everything back. That was the fundamental bargain of life in ancient Mesopotamia, and the Sumerians, or rather, the generations of people who slowly became the Sumerians, spent centuries trying to renegotiate the terms. The Tigris and Euphrates were not gentle rivers. They were not the kind of slow, predictable waterways you might picture when someone says the word river in a soothing voice at bedtime. They were powerful, seasonal, and deeply unpredictable. Unlike the Nile, which flooded on a remarkably consistent annual schedule, so consistent that Egyptian farmers could practically set a calendar by it. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded at different times, at different intensities, in different years. One spring might bring a gentle rise that moistened the fields and receded politely. The next might bring a wall of brown water that swept away everything built since the last flood. This unpredictability was not a minor inconvenience. It was an existential challenge, and it produced, over long generations of trial and catastrophic error, one of the most consequential inventions in human history, the irrigation canal. Now, a canal does not sound exciting. It does not have the dramatic appeal of, say, a ziggurat, or the romantic resonance of a clay tablet covered in ancient poetry. But the irrigation canal, a simple trench dug from a river to a field, changed the world more profoundly than almost any other human innovation. It meant that water could be moved, controlled, directed, stored. It meant that agriculture was no longer at the mercy of the sky. The earliest Mesopotamian canals were modest affairs, shallow channels dug with wooden tools and shaped by hand, running short distances from the riverbank to nearby fields. They did not require engineers or estate planning. A family or a small community could dig one in a few weeks, and the results would have been immediately obvious. Crops that grew reliably, even in dry years, fed by water drawn from a river that was always there, even when the rains were not. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound of water moving through one of those first canals. A soft, steady trickle, not a rush, just a gentle push of water finding its way along a new path, soaking in a dry soil, darkening it from pale dust to rich brown. The smell of wet earth rising in the warm air. A farmer kneeling at the edge of the channel, watching the water spread, knowing, perhaps for the first time with real certainty, that this year's crop will grow. That small moment of certainty was the foundation of everything that came next. Because once you can feed people reliably, more people survive. More people means more hands to work. More hands means bigger canals. Bigger canals means more fields. More fields means more food. More food means you can support people who do not farm. Administrators, craftspeople, priests, builders. And the moment you can support people who do not farm, you are no longer just a village. You are becoming something else. The scale of Sumerian water management grew steadily over centuries. By the time the great cities of Uruk and Ur were in their prime, roughly 3000 BCE, the canal network in southern Mesopotamia was vast. Channels branched off the main rivers in elaborate webs, feeding fields across a wide agricultural hinterland. Secondary channels were dug to drain excess water in wet years. Levees were built up along the riverbanks to contain floods. Sluice gates, simple wooden barriers that could be raised or lowered to control water flow, were used to manage distribution. This was not just farming. This was hydraulic engineering, and it required something that the earlier marsh villages had not needed in quite the same way: coordination. Large-scale canal maintenance could not be done by a single family. Channels silted up continuously and needed regular dredging. Levees needed repair after every flood season. Water allocation disputes, who gets how much water and when, needed to be settled by someone with the authority to settle them. This is where the seeds of government were planted, quite literally in the mud. Historians still argue about the precise relationship between irrigation and the rise of the Sumerian state. One influential theory, associated with the historian Carl Wittfogel, suggested that large-scale water management essentially required centralized authoritarian government, and that this hydraulic necessity was the engine that drove the rise of early states. Later scholars have pushed back on this idea considerably, pointing out that early canal systems were often managed at the community level without any central authority directing them. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the muddier middle. What has seemed clear is that the need to manage water, to build and maintain canals, to allocate resources fairly, to plan across seasons and years, created new social roles and new forms of authority. Someone had to keep track of who had dug how much of the communal channel and who therefore had a right to how much of the communal water. Someone had to call the village together when a levee needed emergency repair before the spring floods arrived. Someone had to remember, from year to year, which fields had received too much water and which had received too little. That someone became, over generations, the administrator, the record keeper, the proto-bureaucrat. And the proto-bureaucrat, bless them, eventually invented writing. But not yet. For now, the canal is new. The water moves slowly and steadily through it, catching the late afternoon sun in bright, rippling flashes. Barley seedlings, pale green and impossibly delicate, push up through the dark, wet soil on either side. A child runs along the canal bank, stops, crouches to look at a frog sitting motionless at the water's edge. The frog does not move. The child moves on. The water keeps flowing. And somewhere downstream, without anyone quite noticing, a city is beginning to stir. Something was changing. You could feel in the air, if you were there, a certain density of activity. More smoke on the horizon, more boats on the river, more voices carrying across the flat land in the early morning, more sounds of construction, more paths worn deep into the earth by the feet of people moving with purpose between places that were growing slowly and steadily, too large to call villages anymore. The world's first cities were not built in a day. They were not planned by a visionary architect standing over a drawing table with a grand design in mind. They grew the way that most truly important things grow. Gradually, pragmatically, one small decision at a time, each generation inheriting a slightly larger and more complex version of what the previous generation had built. But by roughly 4000 BCE, something genuinely unprecedented was happening in southern Mesopotamia. Cities were appearing. The first and most spectacular of these was Uruk. Uruk sits in what is now southern Iraq, not far from the modern town of Warqa. Today, it is an archaeological site, a series of eroded mud brick mounds rising from a flat, dusty plain, surrounded by the ghost outlines of ancient walls and long-vanished buildings. It does not look like much from a distance. But beneath and within those mounds lies the evidence of something extraordinary, the remains of what was, for a significant period around 3500 to 3000 BCE, almost certainly the largest city on Earth. At its peak, Uruk may have housed somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 people within its walls. To put that in perspective, in a world where most human settlements still numbered in the hundreds, Uruk was the size of a modern mid-sized town, packed into mud brick buildings along narrow streets, served by canals that brought water and goods from the surrounding countryside, organized around a monumental temple complex at its center that could be seen for miles across the flat plain. It was, by any reasonable definition, a metropolis, and it had not existed 2,000 years earlier. The growth of Uruk, and of other early Sumerian cities like Eridu, Ur, Nippur, and Lagash, was driven by several forces working together in a kind of self-reinforcing cycle. Reliable agriculture fed more people. More people meant more labor. More labor meant larger canals, bigger harvests, surplus grain. Surplus grain meant you could trade. Trade meant contact with distant peoples. Contact meant new ideas, new materials, new demands. New demands meant more specialization, more potters, more weavers, more metalworkers, more administrators. And all of those people needed somewhere to live. The cities of ancient Sumer were dense and, by modern standards, remarkably compact. Houses were built close together, sharing walls to save on materials and provide mutual insulation from the brutal summer heat. Streets were narrow, often barely wide enough for two people to pass each other comfortably. There were no grand urban boulevards. There were warrens of mud brick, punctuated by open courtyards where families gathered in the evenings when the worst of the heat had passed. The mud brick itself is worth pausing on. In a region with almost no stone and very little timber, mud was the universal building material. Mesopotamian mud, river silt mixed with water, sometimes reinforced with chopped straw, was shaped into rectangular bricks, pressed into wooden molds, and left to dry in the sun. Sun-dried mud brick is surprisingly durable in a dry climate. It insulates well. It is cheap to produce and easy to repair. When a building eventually collapsed or was abandoned, its remains were simply leveled and built over, which is why Mesopotamian archaeological sites are mounds. Every mound is a compressed record of centuries of building and rebuilding, layer upon layer, city upon city, each generation living on top of the last. The oldest of the Sumerian cities may not be Uruk, actually. Eridu, located south of Ur in what is now a remote desert, carries a compelling claim to being the very first city. It appears in the ancient Sumerian king list, a remarkable document that attempts to record every king of Sumer from the beginning of time, as the first city where kingship descended from heaven. Archaeologists have found evidence of continuous settlement at Eridu going back to approximately 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in Mesopotamia. There is something quietly moving about Eridu. It is now completely abandoned. The desert has reclaimed it entirely. But 17 layers of temple construction have been found there, stacked one on top of another across thousands of years. Each generation building a new temple on the sacred ground of the previous one, maintaining an unbroken thread of devotion to a place that clearly meant something deep and enduring to the people who lived nearby. Historians still argue about what exactly caused the rapid urban growth of this period, a phenomenon archaeologists call the Uruk expansion. Some emphasize climate changes that push people toward the river valleys. Others point to trade network development. Others focus on the organizational advantages that large communities offered in managing complex irrigation systems. The most likely answer involves all of these forces at once, building on each other across centuries of gradual change. But whatever drove it, the result was unmistakable. Where there had been marsh villages and small farming communities, there are now cities. Real cities, with economies and administrations and populations large enough that most people living within them would never personally know most of their neighbors. That anonymity, the experience of being surrounded by strangers, was itself something new in human experience. And it changed everything about how people thought about rules and authority and identity. The city is waking up now. You can hear it. The low hum of thousands of people beginning their day, the sound of the river, the smell of bread baking somewhere nearby, the distant thud of construction echoing across rooftops still cool from the night. Somewhere at the city's center, rising above all of it, a great mud brick platform catches the first light of morning. We will visit it soon. There is something at the heart of every Sumerian city. You cannot miss it. Even from a great distance, crossing the flat plain on foot or drifting downriver on a loaded reed boat, you would see it long before you saw anything else. It rises above the rooftops like a small artificial mountain, a great step platform of mud brick, broader at the base than at the top, climbing in 2 or 3 receding terraces toward a small shrine at its summit. This is the ziggurat. In an ancient Sumer, it was everything. The word ziggurat comes from the Akkadian zikkuratu, meaning something like to build on a raised area or mountain peak. The Sumerians themselves used their own term, but the meaning was similar. The ziggurat was quite deliberately a man-made mountain in a land that had no mountains at all. It was a vertical statement in a horizontal world, a place where the flat earth reached upward and touched, or tried to touch, whatever was above it. The gods, in Sumerian theology, lived at the top. Now, before we go further, it is worth taking a quiet moment to simply stand at the base of one of these structures and look up. The most famous surviving ziggurat is the Great Ziggurat of Uar, built around 2100 BCE by King Uarnemu, a name we will encounter again later in our story. It still stands today, partially reconstructed, in the desert of southern Iraq. Its base measures approximately 64 by 45 meters. It would have originally risen to perhaps 30 meters in height, roughly the height of a 10-story building. Every surface was covered in kiln-fired brick, waterproofed with bitumen, and the terraces were planted with trees so that the whole structure appeared from a distance to be a lush, green, living mountain rising improbably from the desert floor. Imagine standing at its base on a hot afternoon. The baked brick radiates warmth. The shadow at the base is cool and sharp. Above you, the terraces recede in steps, each one narrower than the last, climbing toward a small temple chamber at the very top, where, according to Sumerian belief, the city's patron deity actually resided, not symbolically, but literally in a physical sense, in the way that a person lives in a house. The god had a bedroom, a dining room, staff, This is not a metaphor. Sumerian temple records, and we have many of them, because the Sumerians recorded almost everything, describing careful administrative detail the daily routine of the temple deity. The god was woken in the morning by priests, bathed, dressed in fine linen garments, presented with meals of bread, beer, fish, roasted meat, and seasonal fruits, entertained with music, allowed to rest in the afternoon, given an evening meal, put to bed. The deity's statue, a carved figure of stone or precious wood, was the physical vessel through which all of this ritual occurred. It was treated with absolute seriousness, as though the god were genuinely present within it. And for the Sumerians, the god was. Each city had its own patron deity. Uruk belonged to Inanna, goddess of love, war, and desire, a goddess of remarkable complexity and narrative richness, about whom we will hear more in a later section. Eridu belonged to Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. Nippur was sacred to Enlil, god of wind and storms, and the most powerful deity in the Sumerian pantheon. Uar was the city of Nana, the moon god, whose great ziggurat still rises from the desert today. This divine geography mattered enormously, because the god was not merely a spiritual patron. The god was, in a very real administrative and economic sense, the owner of the city. The Sumerian temple was not just a place of worship. It was a palace, a warehouse, a granary, a workshop, a school, a bank. The temple complex employed hundreds of workers, farmers who tended the god's fields, craftspeople who produced goods for the god's estate, scribes who recorded every transaction involving the god's property, priests who managed the god's daily needs, and administrators who oversaw the entire operation. The temple, in the earliest period of Sumerian urban life, was the economy. Grain flowed into the temple's storerooms from the surrounding fields. It was redistributed to workers as rations, a system that was part employment, part welfare, and part taxation, all rolled into one. What came in from the temple flocks and went out as finished textiles. Fish, dates, sesame oil, all passed through the temple's administrative hands. Records were kept of every transaction, every worker, every ration, every delivery. This is actually how writing began, not with poetry, not with philosophy, but with the temple accountant trying desperately to keep track of everything. We will get to that in the next section. Historians still debate how absolute the temple's economic dominance actually was. Earlier scholarship tended to describe the early Sumerian economy as a kind of pure temple socialism, with the institution controlling all production and distribution. More recent analysis of the archaeological evidence suggests a more mixed picture. Private land ownership and independent trade existed alongside the temple economy from a relatively early period. But the temple's central role, spiritual, administrative, economic, architectural, is beyond dispute. And the ziggurat, rising above everything, was its most visible expression. There is something deeply calming about the image of it, if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. The city spreading out below, the narrow streets, the mud brick houses, the canal glinting in the afternoon light, the smell of bread and river water and warm dust. And above all of it, that great stepped mountain of brick planted with trees, catching the last light of day on its highest terrace, the small shrine at the top glowing faintly gold. Somewhere up there, according to everyone who lived in that city, a god was having dinner, and the city below went on about its evening, reassured. Let's begin with a problem. Imagine you are a temple administrator in ancient Uruk, sometime around 3400 BCE. Your city has perhaps 50,000 people in and around it. The temple complex you manage is the economic heart of that city. Every day, goods flow in and out, grain from hundreds of farms, wool from thousands of sheep, fish from the river, dates from the palm groves, finished textiles from the weaving workshops, rations going out to hundreds of workers. Every single transaction needs to be tracked, not because anyone is particularly suspicious of anyone else, though that may also have been true, but because the system simply cannot function without accurate records. Who delivered how much grain? Who received how many rations? Which fields belonged to which temple estate? How much will came in last month? And how much went out as finished cloth? You cannot hold all of this in your head. No one can. For a while, the Sumerians managed with clay tokens, small geometric shapes of clay, each representing a specific quantity of a specific commodity. A cone meant a small measure of grain. A sphere meant a large measure. A cylinder meant an animal. These tokens could be stored in clay envelopes, sealed with a stamp, and kept as physical records of transactions. It was a workable system for a while. But as the cities grew and the transactions multiplied, the token system began to creak under the weight of its own complexity. The envelopes were bulky. You could not tell what was inside without breaking the seal. And the range of things that needed to be recorded was expanding constantly, not just grain and animals, but labor, land, debt, ownership time. Something new was needed. What happened next is one of the most consequential moments in human history, though it happened quietly, in a small room somewhere in Uruk with a reed and a lump of wet clay. Someone, we do not know who, and we never will, pressed the end of a cut reed into the surface of a wet clay tablet at an angle, producing a wedge-shaped impression. They then pressed it again at different angles in different combinations to produce marks that stood for specific things. Not pictures exactly, though the earliest writing did begin with simple pictographic representations of objects. More like a code, a set of agreed-upon symbols that any trained person could read. This system is called cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. And it began not as literature, not as poetry, not as the recording of history or myth or law, but as accounting. The oldest known written documents in the world are administrative records from Uruk, dating to approximately 3,200 BCE. They record deliveries of barley and distributions of beer rations. They list workers and their wages. They inventory temple storerooms. They are, in the most literal sense, receipts. The world's first writing was bureaucratic paperwork. There is something both deflating and deeply human about this. We might like to imagine that the first words ever written were something profound, a prayer, a poem, a declaration of love or wonder at the stars. Instead, the first words were essentially 37 units of barley received, 29 distributed, balance 8. But do not let that deflate you too much, because writing, once invented, does not stay in the accounting room for long. Within a few centuries of its first appearance, cuneiform had expanded dramatically. It was being used to record not just transactions but legal agreements, royal decrees, religious hymns, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, and eventually, around 2100 BCE, the world's first great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, recorded on clay tablets in cuneiform script, is a story of friendship, loss, the fear of death, and the search for immortality that feels, when you read it today, startlingly modern. We will visit Gilgamesh and his world in a later section. For now, let us linger a little longer in the scriptorium, the temple school where scribes were trained. The Adaba, as it was called in Sumerian, the tablet house, was a serious institution. Training to become a scribe took years. Students practiced by copying lists, long, exhaustive lists of words, plants, animals, professions, geographic features, legal terms. These lists were not just learning exercises. They were, in a sense, the Sumerians' attempt to organize and contain the entire knowable world in written form. If you could list everything, you could, in some meaningful sense, know everything. Historians still argue about how widely literacy extended beyond the scribal class in ancient Sumer. Some scholars suggest that a surprising number of merchants and administrators could read basic cuneiform. Others argue that true literacy remained the exclusive preserve of a small trained elite. The evidence cuts both ways, and the question remains genuinely open. What is clear is that the scribes knew their own value. We have school texts from the Adaba, actual exercise tablets written by students learning their craft, that describe the daily routine of a young scribe in surprisingly vivid terms. He wakes early. He is late to school. His teacher beats him. He goes home and complains to his father, who reassures him that the life of a scribe is better than any other. The student goes back. The oldest recorded complaint about homework is Sumerian, and it is somehow exactly what you would expect. The reed presses into the clay. The wedge-shaped marks accumulate across the tablet's surface, row by careful row. Outside, the city hums and breathes. The river moves. The sun crosses the sky. And for the first time in human history, something of all of it, the grain counts, the ration lists, the prayers, the stories, the complaints, is being saved. Not in memory, which fades. In clay, which does not. The clay tablet survived because of an accident. Not the careful preservation of archivists. Not the foresight of ancient librarians building climate-controlled storage rooms. The tablet survived because the cities burned. When fire swept through a Mesopotamian mud brick building, whether from warfare, accident, or the deliberate destruction that marked the end of one political era and the beginning of another, the clay tablets stored inside were not destroyed. They were fired, transformed from soft, sun-dried records into hard, kiln-hardened ceramic. The same process that makes pottery permanent made the tablets permanent. The great irony of Mesopotamian history is that we know more about the cities that were violently destroyed than about those that simply faded quietly away. And what those fired tablets tell us is extraordinary. We have, at current count, somewhere in the region of 500,000 cuneiform tablets in museum collections around the world. Many more remain unexcavated in the ground. The majority are still untranslated, not because scholars are uninterested, but because the sheer volume of material is genuinely overwhelming. There are tablets that have been sitting in museum storage since the 19th century, cataloged but unread, waiting for someone to finally sit down with them. Each one is a small window into a vanished world. The administrative tablets are the most numerous, and in their dry way, the most revealing. They tell us about the scale of Sumerian economic life with startling precision. One set of tablets from the city of Girsu records the labor of over 1,000 workers employed by the temple estate. Their names, their daily rations of barley and oil and wool, their job assignments, their absences. It is essentially an ancient payroll spreadsheet, and it is fascinating. We know, from tablets like these, that Sumerian workers were paid partly in beer, not as a novelty or a perk. Beer, thick, nutritious, made from fermented barley and consumed through a reed straw to filter out the solid particles, was a staple food. It provided calories, hydration, and a modest amount of intoxication that may have made long days of canal digging more bearable. Daily rations for workers typically included a measure of barley bread and a measure of beer, with additional allocations for skilled workers and supervisors. The Sumerians also wrote the world's oldest known beer recipe, preserved on a tablet known as the Hymn to Ninkasi, a poem addressed to the goddess of beer that doubles as a step-by-step brewing guide. It describes soaking barley, making bapper, a kind of twice-baked bread used as a fermentation starter, and the careful process of producing a drink that, according to the hymn, makes the heart feel wonderful and the liver happy. The liver, in Sumerian physiology, was the seat of the emotions, which explains a great deal. Beyond the administrative records, the tablets open into a rich literary world that most people never associate with ancient Mesopotamia. We have love poetry of genuine tenderness, hymns written in the voice of Inanna, the great goddess, addressed to her lover Dumuzi, full of imagery of gardens and sweet dates and the warmth of night. We have wisdom literature, collections of proverbs and maxims that feel surprisingly applicable today. One Sumerian proverb reads, in essence, the fox having urinated into the sea said, "The entire sea is my urine." It is a 3,000-year-old joke about a particular kind of self-important person, and it remains entirely recognizable. We have medical texts describing treatments for various conditions using herbal preparations, poultices, and ritual incantations, a system in which the physical and the spiritual were not separated, because in Sumerian thinking they were not separate things. We have astronomical observations recorded with careful precision, the movements of stars and planets tracked across seasons and years. We have mathematical tables, multiplication tables, square root tables, calculations of areas and volumes used in construction and land surveying. The Sumerians develop a number system based on 60 rather than 10. This is why we still divide an hour into 60 minutes, a minute into 60 seconds, and a circle into 360 degrees. Every time you glance at a clock, you are using Sumerian mathematics. And then there is the world's oldest known written complaint. It dates to approximately 1750 BCE, which is, admittedly, after the height of the Sumerian period and technically from the Old Babylonian era, but it is written in a tradition of record-keeping and commercial communication that the Sumerians established. A merchant named Nasir sold copper ingots to a man named Nani. The copper was substandard. Nani sent a servant all the way to Nasir's city to complain in person and deliver a clay tablet expressing his displeasure. The tablet, now in the British Museum, is remarkable in its directness. It describes Nasir's behavior as contemptible. It demands proper copper or a full refund. It expresses, with genuine feeling, the indignity of having been treated so badly after years of good commercial relations. Historians still debate whether Nasir ever actually made good on the complaint. Other tablets found in his house suggest he may have been a serial offender in the quality of copper department. The tablets also preserve something more difficult and more moving. They preserve voices. Not voices in a metaphorical sense, but actual individual human voices, preserved in clay for 4,000 years. The student who was late to school and got beaten. The scribe who wrote a tender poem for someone he loved. The farmer who carefully recorded a bad harvest year, noting the flood that came too early and the crop that did not recover. People. Specific, individual people with names and habits and frustrations and hopes. The clay kept all of it. And tonight, in the quiet, with the lights low and the city outside, doing whatever cities do at this hour, those voices are still here. 37 units of barley received. 29 distributed. Balance 8. The reed is set down. The tablet is placed carefully on a shelf to dry. Someone 4,000 years ago finished their work for the day. Before we go further into the practical world of Sumerian cities and commerce and law, let's pause here for a moment. Let us sit with the stories. Because the Sumerians were not only administrators and farmers and engineers. They were storytellers of extraordinary depth and imagination. They looked at the world around them, the floods and droughts, the turning of seasons, the mystery of birth and death, the incomprehensible scale of the sky, and they told stories to make sense of it all. Those stories are still with us. The Sumerian pantheon was vast and complex, populated by dozens of major deities and hundreds of minor ones, each with specific domains, personalities, and relationships to one another that were elaborated over centuries of myth-making. At the top of the divine hierarchy sat a council of 7, the Inanna, or great gods, who made the fundamental decisions about the fate of the universe and, by extension, the fate of humanity. The highest of these was in the sky god, distant, serene, and somewhat remote, the way that very powerful people sometimes are. Below him in practical authority was Enlil, god of wind and storms and the breath of life, who was also the god most directly concerned with human affairs and most likely to be angry about them. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, was the trickster of the pantheon, clever, inventive, fond of humans, and frequently intervening to protect them from Enlil's more destructive impulses. And then there was Inanna. Inanna deserves her own paragraph, her own chapter really, but we have a schedule to keep. Inanna was the goddess of love, desire, fertility, war, justice, and political power. She was the planet Venus, both the morning star and the evening star, and her dual nature as both was built into her character. She was simultaneously nurturing and terrifying, creative and destructive, passionately loving and capable of breathtaking cruelty. She was worshipped with tremendous devotion across all of Mesopotamia for thousands of years, eventually absorbed into the Akkadian tradition as Ishtar, and her influence can be traced through subsequent Near Eastern goddesses across cultures and centuries. The myths surrounding Inanna are among the most remarkable literary achievements of the ancient world. In the myth known as the Descent of Inanna, the goddess decides to descend into the underworld, the realm of the dead, ruled by her older sister Ereshkigal. The reasons for this journey are somewhat ambiguous, which has kept scholars productively arguing about it ever since. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, Inanna is required to surrender one of her divine attributes: her crown, her lapis lazuli staff, her robe, her breastplate, her golden ring, until she arrives before her sister stripped of everything, entirely vulnerable. She is killed. Her corpse is hung on a hook. 3 days pass, and then, through a rescue engineered by the clever god Enki, characteristically sends help in the form of 2 small creatures fashioned from the dirt under his fingernails, which is exactly the kind of solution Enki would come up with. Inanna is restored to life, but she cannot leave the underworld without sending someone to replace her. The someone she chooses, after finding that her husband Dumuzi has not been properly mourning her absence, is Dumuzi himself. Historians still argue about what the descent of Inanna represents at its deepest level, whether it is a seasonal fertility myth, a psychological narrative about death and transformation, a theological statement about the nature of divine power, or something else entirely. The text rewards multiple interpretations simultaneously, which is part of what makes it so enduring. There was also a great flood. The Sumerian flood myth, preserved in a text known as the Eridu Genesis, as well as in the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells of a time when the gods decided to destroy humanity with a catastrophic deluge. One man, warned in advance by the sympathetic Enki, builds a great boat, survives the flood, and is granted immortality as a reward. The parallels with the later biblical account of Noah are obvious and have been a source of fascination and controversy since the 19th century, when cuneiform scholars first deciphered these texts, and European intellectual society went into something of an uproar. Historians debate the direction of influence. Did the Sumerian myth influence the biblical narrative, or do both draw on an even older shared tradition? The most widely accepted view today is that the biblical flood story drew, directly or indirectly, on Mesopotamian sources. But the question of where the underlying flood memory, if it is a memory, ultimately originates remains open. There may be a real flood somewhere at the root of it. Geological evidence suggests that the Black Sea Basin experienced a dramatic flooding event sometime around 5600 BCE, when rising Mediterranean waters broke through what is now the Bosphorus. Whether this event is the origin of the flood myths of the ancient Near East, or whether the myth grew from the very real and very terrifying annual floods of the Tigris and Euphrates, is a question that still has no settled answer. The Sumerian creation myth, meanwhile, begins not with a divine being creating the world from nothing, but with the world already existing in a state of primordial union between sky and earth. And in key, heaven and earth were once a single entity. Their separation was the beginning of everything. The space between things is where the world happens. There is a restfulness to the Sumerian mythological world, beneath its drama and complexity. It is a world densely populated with intelligence and meaning. Every river, every reed bed, every evening star carrying a story, a name, a relationship to everything else. The night sky above ancient Uruk was not empty. It was full. And tonight, if you look up, past the ceiling, past the roof, past whatever clouds or city lights stand between you and the stars, it still is. Let us come down from the ziggurat now, down from the myths and the gods and the great administrative machinery of the temple complex, down through the narrow streets, past the mud brick walls still warm from the afternoon sun, past the smell of cooking fires and bread and river water, into the everyday world of the people who actually lived in these cities. Because the Sumerians were not only priests and kings and scribes, they were also farmers, brewers, fishermen, weavers, potters, carpenters, merchants, midwives, musicians, and the kind of people who argued loudly with their neighbors about whose goat had eaten whose garden. Which brings us, briefly and affectionately, to one of the great underappreciated documents of ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerian dispute literature. The Sumerians had a tradition of writing formal debates between pairs of opposing things. Summer and winter debate, which is more valuable. The hoe and the plow argue about which does more important work. The bird and the fish contest their relative merits before the gods. These debates are stylized literary exercises, but embedded within them are rich details about how the Sumerians understood their own economy, their seasons, their environment, and their values. They're also, occasionally, quite funny. But before we linger too long in the library, let us step outside. Morning in a Sumerian city would have begun before dawn. The heat of the day in southern Mesopotamia, even today regularly exceeding 45 degrees Celsius in summer, made early morning the most productive time for physical work. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to become genuinely punishing, the serious outdoor labor of the day was ideally already done. People rose in darkness, fed their animals, fetched water from the canal, started cooking fires. The staple foods of the Sumerian diet were barley bread and beer, supplemented by fish, dates, onions, garlic, lentils, chickpeas, and seasonal vegetables grown in small household garden plots watered by hand from the canal. Meat, sheep, goat, occasionally cattle, was eaten, but was not an everyday food for ordinary people. It appeared at festivals, at temple rituals, and on the tables of the wealthy. The beer deserves another mention here, because it was genuinely central to daily life. Sumerian beer was thick and nutritious, more like a liquid bread than what we would recognize as beer today. It was consumed through a long reed straw, held at an angle into a large communal vessel, which filtered out the solid grain particles floating in the brew. Images of multiple people drinking from a single vessel through individual reed straws appear repeatedly in Sumerian art. It was a social activity, shared and communal, the ancient equivalent of gathering around a table. The average Sumerian worker received a daily beer ration of approximately 1 liter. Skilled workers and supervisors received more. The eccentric detail worth pausing on here is that we have evidence of Sumerian workers going on what might be described as an ancient labor action, stopping work on temple construction because their beer rations were late. The tablet recording this event is admirably matter-of-fact about it. The workers stopped. The ration arrived. The workers resumed. The scribe recorded everything with the serene neutrality of someone who had seen it all before. The world's first recorded work stoppage was about beer. Homes in Sumerian cities were built around a central courtyard, an open space that served as the heart of domestic life. Cooking was done in the courtyard or just outside the house. Animals, a goat, some chickens, perhaps a dog, shared the courtyard space. Children played there. On hot nights, families slept there rather than inside, where the mud brick walls retained the heat of the day long after sunset. The furniture was simple. Low tables, reed mats, and woven wool blankets for sleeping. Clay vessels of every size for storage, cooking, and eating. Oil lamps, small clay cups with a pinched spout holding a floating wick, provided the only light after dark. Their flame was tiny, barely enough to read by, which was fine because most people could not read. The Sumerians were, by the standards of their time, a relatively prosperous society. Archaeological evidence suggests that even ordinary households had access to a reasonable variety of goods. But prosperity was not evenly distributed. The temple estates and the households of wealthy merchants and landowners lived very differently from the farmers and laborers who made up the majority of the population. Slavery existed in ancient Sumer. Slaves were acquired through warfare, debt, and in some cases birth. They could be bought, sold, and inherited. They could also, in certain circumstances, earn their freedom. Sumerian law codes contain provisions for the manumission of slaves, and some slaves appear in tablets as participants in commercial life, managing businesses on behalf of their owners. This does not make the institution less brutal. It makes it more complicated, which is perhaps the honest thing to say about it. Women in Sumerian society occupied a more complex position than in many later ancient civilizations. In the earliest periods, women could own property, conduct business, and appear as independent parties in legal documents. Female scribes existed, though they were rare. The high priestess of the moon god at Uar was one of the most powerful religious figures in all of Mesopotamia, a position held, in one famous case, by Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who is the world's first named author of literary works. Her hymns to Inanna, written in approximately 2300 BCE, are still read today. As the evening cools and the day's work is done, the courtyard fills again. A child falls asleep on a reed mat in the corner. Somewhere nearby, someone is playing a small lyre, the kind found in the royal tombs of Uar, beautifully preserved, their wooden frames long decayed, but their golden bullhead decorations still gleaming. The music drifts over the rooftops. The stars appear, one by one, above the city. And the day ends the way it has ended here, in this flat, warm land between the rivers for thousands and thousands of years. Quietly, southern Mesopotamia had a problem. It was, in many ways, one of the most fertile and productive regions on Earth. The rivers brought water. The flat land was easy to farm. The climate, brutal as it was in summer, allowed for long growing seasons. The Sumerians had mastered irrigation, built cities, invented writing, and organized themselves into the most sophisticated administrative societies the world had yet seen. But the land had almost nothing else. No stone, no metal, no timber worth speaking of. The mountains that contained these things were far away. The cedar forests of Lebanon and Anatolia, the copper deposits of Oman and Cyprus, the lapis lazuli mines of Afghanistan, the gold sources of Egypt and Nubia, the carnelian beads of the Indus Valley. All of it was out there, scattered across a vast geography, separated from the flat river delta by hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers of desert, mountain, and sea. And the Sumerians wanted all of it. Not just wanted, needed. Because a civilization that has developed complex metallurgy, monumental architecture, and a taste for luxury goods cannot easily go back to living without copper tools and lapis lazuli jewelry. The appetite grows with the eating. And so the Sumerians did what humans have always done when they needed something they did not have. They want to get it. Sumerian long-distance trade is one of the most remarkable and underappreciated aspects of their civilization. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, roughly 2500 BCE, Sumerian merchants were participating in a network of commercial exchange that stretched from the Mediterranean coast in the west to the Indus Valley in the east, and from the highlands of Anatolia in the north to the Arabian Peninsula coast in the south. The primary vehicle for this trade was the river. Mesopotamia is, at its heart, a river civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates were not just sources of water and flood risk. They were highways. A loaded reed boat could travel downstream with minimal effort carried by the current. Upstream travel was harder but manageable using poles, oars, and sometimes teams of workers on the bank pulling tow lines. The rivers connected the cities of southern Mesopotamia to each other and, via their upper tributaries, to the highlands and trade routes beyond. For longer sea voyages, Sumerian merchants used routes through the Persian Gulf, what the ancient texts call the Lower Sea. reaching the copper-rich coast of Oman, which they called Magan, and the mysterious trading entrepot of Dilmun, which appears to have been located in the region of modern Bahrain. Dilmun deserves a moment of attention. In Sumerian mythology, Dilmun was a paradise, a pure and sacred land where the sun rose, where there was no sickness or death, where clean water flowed in abundance. In commercial reality, Dilmun was a busy trading hub where Sumerian merchants exchanged grain and textiles for copper ingots, pearls, and exotic woods arriving from Magan and from the distant Indus Valley civilization. The Indus Valley connection is particularly extraordinary. We have archaeological evidence, Indus Valley seals found in Mesopotamian contexts, and Mesopotamian objects found in Indus Valley sites, that confirms genuine commercial contact between these two civilizations across a distance of roughly 3,000 kilometers. The merchants who facilitated this trade were moving goods across one of the most challenging geographies on Earth, through the Persian Gulf and along the Makran coast of modern Pakistan. Without compasses, without detailed maps, and without anything we would recognize as a modern communication system. They did it anyway. The Sumerian merchants themselves, the Damgar, as they were called, occupied an interesting social position. They were not quite independent free agents and not quite temple employees. In many cases, they operated as agents of the temple or the palace, using institutional capital to finance their trading ventures and returning a share of the profits to their sponsor. But they also conducted private business alongside their official duties, accumulating personal wealth and passing commercial knowledge down through family networks across generations. We have actual merchant archives, collections of clay tablets preserved in private houses, that give us remarkably detailed pictures of individual trading careers. One famous archive from the old Assyrian trading colony at Canals in Anatolia, which is slightly later than the height of Sumerian civilization but operates in the same commercial tradition, preserves the correspondence of a merchant family over several generations, including letters between husbands on the road and wives managing the home business, complaints about late deliveries, arguments about credit, and the occasional tender personal note tucked between the commercial correspondence. Historians still argue about the degree to which Sumerian long-distance trade was state-controlled versus privately organized. The evidence suggests a genuinely mixed system, with institutional and private enterprise operating in parallel and sometimes in the same person simultaneously. What is certain is that the goods flowed. Copper came in from Magan and was worked into tools and weapons in Mesopotamian workshops. Cedar logs floated down from the Lebanese mountains to become roof beams in temples that would otherwise have had no timber at all. Lapis lazuli traveled from the mines of Badakhshan in Afghanistan to become the deep blue inlay in jewelry, statues, and the famous standard of UR. A remarkable wooden box decorated with lapis lazuli and shell mosaic that depicts Sumerian society in peace and war with extraordinary detail. Gold arrived. Silver arrived. Carnelian arrived from India, worked into beads that archaeologists have found in royal graves. And in exchange, Mesopotamia sent out what it had in abundance: grain, textiles, leather goods, sesame oil, dried fish, and increasingly, the thing that the entire ancient world wanted, the thing that Sumer had invented and that everyone else was slowly adopting: writing. The idea of recording transactions on durable materials spread outward from Mesopotamia along the same trade routes that carried the copper and the lapis lazuli. It arrived in Egypt, where it was adapted into hieroglyphics. It moved into the Levant, where it would eventually become the ancestor of the alphabet you're reading right now. The river boats loaded their cargo in the gray morning light. The merchants checked their tallies one last time. And somewhere on the Persian Gulf, a small dark sail caught the wind and moved slowly toward the horizon, carrying the weight of civilization in its hold. At some point, having a city is not enough. You have the walls. You have the canals. You have the temple rising above everything, the scribes keeping their careful records, the merchants moving goods up and down the river. You have thousands of people living in close proximity, sharing resources, competing for land and water and commercial advantage, falling into debt, disputing inheritances, arguing about whose ox trampled whose barley field. And all of those disputes need somewhere to go. They need a system. The Sumerians understood this early. Long before the famous law code of Hammurabi, the Babylonian king whose carved stone stele, discovered in 1901 and now housed in the Louvre, is probably the most famous legal document of the ancient world. The Sumerians had already been developing written legal traditions for centuries. The oldest known written law code in human history is Sumerian. It is called the Code of Uarnimmu, named after the king of Uar who ruled around 2100 BCE, the same Uarnimmu who built the great ziggurat we visited earlier in our journey. The code survives in fragmentary form on several clay tablets, and its opening is remarkable. Before listing any laws at all, Uarnimmu begins by describing what he has already done for his people. He has established honest weights and measures. He has removed corruption from the land. He has ensured that the orphan does not fall prey to the wealthy, and that the widow does not fall prey to the powerful. It is, in other words, not merely a list of rules. It is a statement of values. The laws themselves cover a wide range of situations. There are provisions for personal injury. If a man injures another man's foot, he pays a specific fine in silver. If he breaks a bone, a larger fine. If he cuts off a nose, larger still. This system of monetary compensation for physical harm, rather than the retaliatory eye for an eye principle more commonly associated with later Mesopotamian law, is one of the features that surprises people most about Uarnimmu's code. It is, in some ways, a more measured approach than what came after it. There are provisions for divorce. Both men and women could initiate divorce under certain conditions, though the terms were not equal. There are provisions for false accusations. If you accuse someone of a crime and cannot prove it, you bear the punishment that would have fallen on the accused. There are provisions for the protection of slaves, including rules against their mistreatment that, while falling far short of abolition, acknowledge their basic humanity in ways that later codes sometimes did not. Before Uarnimmu, there was an even earlier legal tradition. The reforms of Urukagina, or Unimgina, as his name is now more accurately transliterated, king of the city-state of Lagash around 2380 BCE, represent what many historians consider the world's first recorded social reform movement. Urukagina's texts describe a society that had become corrupt and exploitative. Officials were overcharging for everything from funerals to sheep shearing, demanding excessive fees for services that should have been free or low cost, using their positions to extract wealth from ordinary people. Urukagina abolished these abuses. He reduced fees. He protected the weak from the powerful. He declared, in what is perhaps the oldest recorded use of the concept, that he was establishing freedom. Amarji in Sumerian, a word that literally means something like return to the mother, and which represents the first known use of the concept of liberty in any written language. The world's first word for freedom is Sumerian. Historians still argue about how effectively Urukagina's reforms were actually implemented and how long they lasted. His reign ended when Lagash was conquered by the neighboring city-state of Umma under its king Lugalzagizi, which suggests that righteous reform does not always protect you from your neighbors. But the aspiration was there, clearly expressed, in clay, 4,000 years ago. Justice in Sumerian cities was administered through a combination of temple courts, royal courts, and community assemblies. Disputes were heard by judges, typically senior officials or temple administrators, who examined witnesses and documentary evidence, including the clay tablet contracts and records that the Sumerian administrative system produced in such abundance. The clay tablet contract was a cornerstone of Sumerian legal life. Almost any significant transaction, the purchase of land, the terms of a loan, the conditions of employment, the details of a marriage settlement, was recorded on a clay tablet, witnessed, and sometimes sealed in a clay envelope with the cylinder seals of all parties. These cylinder seals, small carved stone rollers that produced a unique impression when rolled across wet clay, with the personal signatures of ancient Mesopotamia, as individual and legally binding as a modern signature. We have thousands of these contracts. They cover everything. A man in ancient Nippur borrows silver and agrees to repay it with interest at the next harvest. A woman in UR inherits her father's house and registers the transfer officially. A farmer near Lagash leases a field from a temple estate for a share of the crop. A merchant in Uruk enters a trading partnership with agreed terms for dividing profit and loss. The eccentric detail worth pausing on here is that we also have tablets recording what happened when things went wrong. Court records of actual disputes heard before Sumerian judges, complete with the testimony of witnesses and the verdict reached. One such tablet records a murder trial in which the victim's wife is accused of complicity in her husband's death. The court examines witnesses, deliberates, and delivers a verdict. It is the oldest known murder trial in recorded history. And reading the tablet today, the careful listing of witnesses, the weighing of testimony, the formal pronouncement of judgment, it feels less alien than you might expect. The river moves outside the courthouse wall. A scribe records the verdict in careful wedge-shaped marks. Someone, somewhere, receives justice, or at least its ancient approximation. The sun sets over the city. The law endures. Nothing lasts forever. Not even the civilization that invented writing, cities, law, and the 60-minute hour. The decline of Sumerian civilization was not a single catastrophic event. No one moment when everything collapsed and the lights went out across Mesopotamia. It was slower and more complicated than that. It was a long, uneven process of pressure and adaptation, of outside forces pressing in and internal structures bending and eventually breaking, of one world gradually becoming another, while much of what had been built quietly persisted underneath the new surface. It is, in other words, less like a building falling down and more like a river changing course. The first major disruption came from the north. Around 2334 BCE, a figure emerged from the city of Kish who would become one of the most consequential rulers in ancient history. His name was Sargon, or more precisely, his adopted name was Sargon, meaning something like the true king, and he founded the world's first empire. Sargon of Akkad. The Akkadians were a Semitic-speaking people who had been living alongside the Sumerians in Mesopotamia for centuries, gradually absorbing Sumerian culture, adopting cuneiform writing for their own language, worshipping Sumerian gods under Akkadian names. They were not outsiders in any simple sense, but under Sargon, they became rulers. Sargon's campaigns of conquest swept through the Sumerian city-states one by one. Uruk fell. Ur fell. Lagash fell. Sargon reportedly destroyed the walls of every city he conquered, a symbolic act of dominance that prevented future military resistance while leaving the cities themselves largely intact and functional. He was not interested in rubble. He was interested in revenue. At its height, the Akkadian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, a territory no single ruler had ever controlled before. Sargon's capital, Agade, was built as a new imperial center whose location has never been conclusively identified by archaeologists, which gives it an appropriately mysterious quality. The Akkadian Empire did not last long by historical standards. Within roughly a century and a half of Sargon's conquests, it was fracturing. His successors faced constant rebellions from the Sumerian city-states, which retained their cultural identities and local loyalties despite Akkadian rule. And then, around 2154 BCE, a new pressure arrived from the mountains to the northeast. The Gutians. The Gutians were a people from the Zagros Mountains whose origins and language remain poorly understood. Another historical mystery that has kept scholars productively arguing for decades. They swept into Mesopotamia during a period of Akkadian weakness and occupied much of the region for roughly a century, a period that later Sumerian sources describe with undisguised horror as a time of chaos and misery. Historians debate how severe the Gutian period actually was. Later Sumerian texts may have exaggerated the disruption for political and literary purposes. Painting the Gutian interlude as maximally terrible made the subsequent Sumerian restoration seem maximally glorious. The archaeological evidence suggests a more complicated picture, with trade and administration continuing in many areas despite the political upheaval. What followed the Gutian period was, remarkably, a Sumerian Renaissance. The third dynasty of Ur, known to historians as Ur3, emerged around 2112 BCE under exactly the Ur-Nammu we met in the previous section. For roughly a century, the Ur3 state represented perhaps the most sophisticated and centrally administered political entity the ancient world had yet produced. Its bureaucracy was extraordinary. We have hundreds of thousands of administrative tablets from this period, recording everything from daily labor assignments to the movement of livestock across vast institutional estates. It was, in many ways, Sumerian civilization at its most organized. And it was also, in a sense, Sumerian civilization holding its breath, because the pressures were building again. From the west, a Semitic people called the Amorites, another Semitic-speaking group, were moving into Mesopotamia in increasing numbers, settling in the cities, intermarrying with the existing population, gradually rising to positions of local authority. From the east, the kingdom of Elam pressed against Mesopotamia's borders with persistent military ambition. Around 2004 BCE, the Ur3 state collapsed. The city of Ur itself was sacked by the Elamites. A remarkable literary lament, the lament for the destruction of Ur, was composed shortly afterward, describing the city's fall with genuine emotional power. The goddess Ningal pleads with the divine assembly to spare her city. The assembly refuses. The city falls. The lament is one of the most moving documents in ancient literature, and it sits in a tradition of city laments that would echo through later cultures for thousands of years. After the fall of Ur3, Mesopotamia fragmented again into competing city-states, many now ruled by Amorite dynasties. The Sumerian language gradually ceased to be spoken as a mother tongue, replaced in everyday life by Akkadian. But it did not disappear. It persisted for centuries as a sacred and literary language, the way Latin persisted in medieval Europe long after it had ceased to be anyone's native speech. Sumerian became the language of scholarship, of religion, of poetry, and the civilization that eventually rose from the fragments of the post-Ur3 world. The Old Babylonian period, crowned by the famous reign of Hammurabi of Babylon around 1792 BC, was built directly on Sumerian foundations. Hammurabi's law code drew on Sumerian legal traditions. His scribes were trained in Sumerian literary forms. His temples were built in the architectural tradition of the Sumerian ziggurat. The river had changed course, but the water was the same water. The reeds still grew along the bank, as they had always grown, bending in the same slow wind that had been moving across this flat land since before the first brick was laid, before the first canal was dug, before the first mark was pressed into wet clay by a hand that did not quite know what it was beginning. The wind moves. The river flows. The city sleeps. We have traveled a long way tonight. From the first reed houses rising from a marsh, through the patient digging of canals and the slow accumulation of surplus and complexity, up through the towering ziggurats and the humming cities and the scribes pressing their careful marks into wet clay by lamplight, we have followed a thread of human ingenuity and persistence across 5,000 years of history. And now, in this last section, let us set down the thread gently. Let us simply hold it for a moment and feel its weight. The Sumerians left the world something that is genuinely difficult to fully comprehend in its scope. Not just writing, though writing alone would be an almost incomprehensible gift. Not just cities, though the idea of the city, the dense, complex, anonymous, endlessly productive gathering of humans in one place, has shaped every subsequent civilization on Earth. Not just law, though the instinct to write down rules and hold power accountable to them is one of the most important ideas our species has ever had. They left us a way of thinking, a habit of mind that says, record things, measure things, organize things, ask what happened last time, and use that knowledge to plan for next time. Build structures, physical structures, administrative structures, legal structures that outlast the individual lives of the people who create them. That habit of mind is so deeply embedded in how the modern world operates that we no longer notice it. It is like asking a fish to notice the water. But it came from somewhere. It came from a flat, hot, flood-prone river delta in what is now southern Iraq, where a group of people whose language has no known relatives built the first cities, wrote the first words, told the first great stories, brewed the first recorded beer, complained about it in writing when it was late, wrote love poems to their gods, mapped the stars, and argued in court over copper ingots. They were, in the fullest sense of the word, people. Not monuments, not abstractions, not the faceless architects of civilization, moving through history in stately procession. They were people who had names and worries and favorite foods and difficult neighbors, and children who were sometimes late to school and sometimes got into trouble, and moments of genuine wonder when they looked up at the night sky from the top of the ziggurat and saw Venus burning bright above the dark plain. Their names are in the clay. In Hedjona, daughter of Sargon, high priestess and poet, who wrote hymns to Inanna that still move readers today. The world's first named author, a woman, writing in a language that no one has spoken as a mother tongue for 4,000 years. Mo, who built the great ziggurat and wrote the first law code and declared, in essence, that a king's first duty was to protect the weak from the powerful. The unnamed scribe in Uruk who pressed the first wedge-shaped mark into wet clay one afternoon, perhaps without quite realizing what they were doing, and gave the world the ability to remember itself. The farmer who carefully noted a bad harvest year. The brewer who composed a hymn to the goddess of beer. The student who was late to school and had a bad day and went home and complained about it, and whose complaint survived in clay for 4,000 years to be read by strangers in a world beyond anything that student could have imagined. All of them here, all of them still. The eccentric detail that stays with me at the end of this long journey is something small and human and utterly characteristic of the Sumerians. We have a tablet dating to approximately 1800 BCE from the Old Babylonian period that directly inherited everything Sumerian, on which a father has written a letter to his son who is studying away from home. The son has apparently not been writing enough. The father is displeased. The tablet says, in essence, "Why have you not written? Are you well? Send news. Your mother is worried." Across 4,000 years of silence, a parent is missing their child, and the child presumably was fine, probably just busy with his studies, meaning to write, putting it off, the way students always have and presumably always will in every civilization, in every language, on every medium from wet clay to whatever comes after the ones we use today. Historians still debate the precise boundaries of what we should call Sumerian civilization, where it begins, where it ends, how to draw the line between Sumerian and Akkadian and Babylonian in a cultural tradition of such deep continuity. The more you look at it, the more the lines blur, which is perhaps the right answer. Civilizations do not end. They transform. The clay tablets are still out there, in museums and storage rooms and unexcavated mounds beneath the Iraqi desert, waiting. 500,000 known tablets, thousands still untranslated, thousands more still in the ground. Each one a small voice. Each one someone's careful record of something that mattered to them on a specific day, in a specific city, beside a specific river. The river still flows. The flat land between the rivers still stretches under that vast sky, under those same stars that the Sumerian astronomers watched and measured and named and wondered about. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you carry more of the Sumerians with you than you probably realize. the hour you measured your evening by, the city or town you live in, the laws that organize your life, the alphabet, however distant a cousin, that these words are written in, the idea that things are worth writing down. That memory matters, that the past, carefully preserved, has something to say to the present. The reed is set down now. The lamp burns low. The tablet is finished. And so we rest here at the edge of the oldest world we know. The reed houses are quiet now. The canals move their slow, dark water toward the sea, as they have always done, carrying nothing tonight but moonlight and the gentle reflections of stars that the Sumerians named and watched and wondered about, just as you might on a clear night when the world is still enough to let you look up. There is something deeply comforting in the age of all of this, in the knowledge that human beings have been doing this, building, worrying, loving, recording, arguing, laughing, watching the stars, missing their children, complaining about their beer rations for so much longer than we usually remember. That the impulse to make something lasting, to press a mark into something durable and say, I was here, this happened, this mattered, that impulse is not modern. It is not new. It is as old as the first city, as old as the first canal, as old as the first careful wedge pressed into wet clay by a hand that has been dust for 4,000 years. You are part of a very long story, a story that began in a marsh, beside two rivers, under a sky full of stars, with people who had names and worries and hopes not entirely unlike your own. They built something that the world is still living in. And tonight, in the warmth and quiet of wherever you are, in whatever city or town or house or room, you're living in it too. The lamp burns lower now. The river sounds, if you listen carefully, are still there beneath everything. The reeds bend in a wind that has been blowing across that flat land since before memory began. Let carry you. You are safe. You are held by a very old world. Rest now. Close your eyes. Sweet dreams.